Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going back in time with Russell Jacoby's Social Amnesia, a critique of contemporary psychology. You sent over some really intriguing excerpts, and I can't wait to unpack them with you. Published in the mid-70s, Jacoby's book dives headfirst into this idea that modern society, particularly capitalist society, has a bit of a memory problem.
It's like society keeps hitting the reset button, right?
Yeah.
But what Jacoby's talking about isn't just like forgetting your anniversary or where you park the car. It's about forgetting the struggles, the radical ideas, the things that challenge the status quo.
So almost like we're being encouraged to forget anything that might rock the boat.
Exactly. And this social amnesia, as he calls it, isn't just some abstract societal trend. Jacoby dives into how it shows up in the field of psychology itself. He argues that psychology, in its pursuit of becoming a hard science, often forgets the social and historical context of its theories.
That's interesting. So it's not that Jacoby's anti-psychology. He's just cautioning against ignoring the bigger picture, like studying a fish out of water. You need the whole picture, not just the fish flopping around on the dock.
Yes, he uses this powerful quote: "The domination of dead labor over living, products over producers, dot challenged. To be transcended, it must first be remembered." Theories risk becoming disconnected from their roots, ignoring how power dynamics and social issues feed into mental distress.
So he's saying that sometimes our anxieties, our unhappiness, they might not just be personal quirks, but symptoms of a larger societal problem.
Exactly. And he takes aim at various schools of thought, Freudian psychoanalysis, neo-Freudians, even existentialism, showing how each, in its own way, risks becoming less about societal critique and more about just helping people adjust to the system.
He's especially critical of the neo-Freudians, isn't he? What's the issue with folks like Adler and Fromm?
Well, think of it like this. You know how sometimes a revolutionary idea gets watered down to make it more mainstream? Jacoby sees that happening here. He calls these guys revisionists because they sort of sanded down the rough edges of Freud to make psychoanalysis more palatable. Adler, for example, shifted the focus away from Freud's emphasis on sexual drives. Instead, he highlighted the drive for power and achieving social goals.
So less about those base urges, more about fitting into society. That does seem like a shift away from Freud's more, let's say, provocative ideas.
Right. And Fromm, while advocating for a humanistic society, still emphasized individual self-realization within the existing system. He seemed to focus on individual happiness without really challenging the structures that might be causing the unhappiness in the first place.
So both Adler and Fromm, despite their good intentions, kind of ended up reinforcing the status quo. Instead of saying, hey, maybe the system itself is the problem, they're saying, here's how to be happy within the system.
That's a great way to put it. And that shift in focus from social critique to individual adjustment is a big deal for Jacoby. He thinks that when psychology becomes solely about the individual, it becomes too easy to ignore those social and political forces that are actually shaping our lives.
It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet when the whole plumbing system is faulty.
Exactly. And that leads us to another key concept in Jacoby's critique: conformist psychology.
Okay, conformist psychology. What's that all about? Give us the rundown.
It's the idea that anxieties, alienation, those feelings of unease that we all experience sometimes are treated as universal human experiences. Just part of the deal of being human.
Instead of asking, is it the system that's making people anxious? It's more like, well, everyone feels anxious sometimes. Here are some coping mechanisms.
Exactly. And that kind of thinking fits perfectly into a system that benefits from people not questioning things too deeply. It's almost like a distraction.
That's a pretty provocative thought. It reminds me of that quote, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." But this is where I'm a bit confused. How does existentialism fit into all this? Weren't those guys all about individual freedom and responsibility?
Right. And you might think that would put them in direct opposition to this idea of conformist psychology. But Jacoby makes a surprising argument. He says that even existentialism can, in a way, become another form of conformist psychology.
Oh, hold on. How did that work?
Because by focusing so much on the individual and their choices, existentialism sometimes risks ignoring the very real constraints that society puts on our freedom. You might feel like a rebel making your own choices, but those choices are still happening within a very specific set of social and economic conditions.
It's like you can choose what flavor of ice cream you want, but you're still stuck in the ice cream parlor.
Exactly. And that limits the potential for real radical change. You're still swimming in the system, even if you're doing it with a cool existential backstroke.
So we've got social amnesia as this big societal trend, and then we see it popping up in different schools of psychology. But Jacoby doesn't just critique, does he? He also explores attempts to kind of bridge these different ways of thinking, like combining psychoanalysis with Marxism.
Yes, this is where things get really fascinating. He dives into what he calls negative psychoanalysis. This is a movement of thinkers like Reich and Fennekel who tried to connect Freudian theory with a Marxist understanding of society.
So they were trying to show how our individual hang-ups and neuroses might be connected to these larger systems of oppression and inequality.
Exactly. They were trying to bring back the focus on subjectivity, on how those economic forces shape our individual consciousness. Jacoby highlights a quote that really captures the essence of this movement. The efforts of Lukács and Korsch, and after them others such as the Frankfurt School, were towards salvaging this lost dimension of Marxism, subjectivity.
It's not just about the nuts and bolts of economics, it's about how those systems make us feel, how they influence our inner lives.
Right. And Reich's work on sexual repression is a great example. He didn't see it as just some personal issue. He argued it was deeply intertwined with the authoritarian structures of society.
So it's not as simple as capitalism makes you neurotic, but there's a connection between our inner world and the outer world.
Yes. But to be fair, Jacoby doesn't fully endorse this approach either. He warns against oversimplifying things and reducing complex social phenomena to just psychological drives.
Got it. So while our psychological makeup is undoubtedly influenced by social conditions, we can't just reduce everything to individual psychology, so it's a two-way street, right?
Exactly. And that complexity is something that often gets lost, especially when people try to oversimplify things.
Now, onto one of the final big points you sent over, theory versus therapy. Jacoby gets into the weeds with Freud, Laing, and Cooper, all giants in the world of psychoanalysis. What's the through line here? What's he getting at with these thinkers?
It all boils down to the inherent tension between their big, sweeping theories about society and the practical reality of therapy. They're working with individuals, trying to help them heal, but can therapy really fix a problem that's deeply rooted in the structure of society itself?
That's a good question. It's like, can therapy really address societal ills, or is it just a Band-Aid on a bullet wound? Did Freud grapple with this question?
Absolutely. Jacoby highlights how Freud's views on this evolved. Early on, he was more optimistic about therapy's potential to cure individual neuroses. But as his thinking matured, he started to recognize the limits of individual treatment in a society that he himself called neurotic.
Wow. So even Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, came to realize that sometimes you need to change the world, not just the patient on the couch.
Yes. Jacoby quotes Freud as saying, "I do not doubt that it would help you if I could change the world to suit your wishes." That's a pretty clear acknowledgement that sometimes the problem isn't the individual, it's the environment they're in.
That's a powerful point. So even within Freud's work, there's this tension between theory and therapy.
Exactly. And Jacoby argues that this tension actually weakens psychoanalysis's revolutionary potential. It ends up becoming more about helping people adapt to the system than challenging the system itself.
Which, as we talked about, could actually end up reinforcing the status quo. It makes me think about Laing and Cooper, who were also trying to develop a more socially conscious approach to therapy.
Right. They were tackling those big existential questions about alienation, identity, meaning in a modern world, all things that tie into Jacoby's larger critique of social amnesia.
Okay, this is really interesting to me, but we're just about out of time for part one of our deep dive.
Don't worry, we've got plenty more to uncover in part two, including how this social amnesia plays out in the work of Laing and Cooper, as well as Jacoby's fascinating take on something called the politics of subjectivity. We'll be right back after a short break. Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when you send over these excerpts, one thing that really jumped out at me was how Jacoby points out this disconnect between these big thinkers' theories about society and how they actually approach individual therapy. It's almost like a philosophical dilemma, right? You have these huge critiques of society, but then you're faced with a person in your office who's struggling. Do you focus on helping that individual adjust, or do you try to tackle the societal issues that might be contributing to their suffering?
And as we discussed in part one, even Freud himself wrestled with this tension.
He really did. Early on, Freud was all about individual therapy as the path to cure neuroses. But later in life, he started to acknowledge the limitations of that approach, especially when the society itself seemed to be, as he put it, neurotic.
Jacoby quotes Freud as saying something like, "If I could change the world to suit your wishes, it would certainly help you." That's a pretty big shift for someone who is considered the father of individual psychotherapy.
It is. And it shows how Freud recognized that individual change can only go so far. Sometimes the environment itself needs to change.
So what does Jacoby think about how this tension plays out in Freud's actual work?
Well, he points out that even though Freud had these incredible theoretical insights about the limits of therapy in a broken system, his actual practice remained focused on the individual. It's almost like his big picture thinking and his day-to-day work were operating on different tracks.
So a bit of a disconnect between theory and practice. Does that weaken the impact of Freud's work, in Jacoby's opinion?
He believes so. Jacoby argues that this tension dilutes the revolutionary potential of psychoanalysis. Instead of being a tool to challenge the system, it becomes more about helping people fit in, which, as we've already discussed, might actually end up strengthening the status quo.
And it makes me think of those thinkers we touched on earlier, Laing and Cooper. They were both trying to bring a more socially conscious lens to therapy, right?
Exactly. They tackle these big existential questions: alienation, identity, the meaning of life in a modern world. They were critical of traditional psychiatry's focus on individual pathology. They argue that mental illness was often a sane response to an insane world.
Wait, so the problem wasn't the individual, it was the society they were living in.
That was a core part of their argument. They were trying to understand mental distress through a social and political lens, which, totally lines up with Jacoby's idea of social amnesia.
It sounds like they're on the same page as Jacoby, wanting to bring that broader context into psychology. But you said Jacoby critiques them too, right? What's his issue with Laing and Cooper?
Well, even though Laing and Cooper were pushing for a more socially aware approach to therapy, Jacoby felt they didn't go far enough. He felt their understanding of how society really works was a bit limited.
What do you mean?
He felt they still put too much emphasis on the individual and their relationships rather than on the bigger social and political forces at play. Like, they'd acknowledged that society has influence, but their solutions were still about individual transformation.
So, in a way, they were still operating within this framework that prioritizes individual change as the main path to liberation.
Exactly. And Jacoby questions whether that's truly possible without also challenging the systems that create these conditions of alienation and distress in the first place.
Yeah.
It's almost like saying you can achieve inner peace while the world around you is on fire.
That's a powerful image. So we've talked a lot about what Jacoby critiques about contemporary psychology, but I'm curious, what does he propose as an alternative? Does he offer solutions?
That's a great question. Honestly, he doesn't offer a clear roadmap or a step-by-step guide in this book. He's more focused on pointing out the problems and encouraging a different way of thinking.
So more of a wake-up call than a how-to manual?
Exactly. He's calling for a more critical and historically informed approach to psychology, one that recognizes the social and political forces shaping both individuals and the field itself. He wants psychology to be more than just a tool for individual adjustment.
He wants it to have some teeth to really challenge the status quo. So what would that look like?
It's about asking tough questions, like whose interests are being served by this theory? Does it reinforce power structures, or does it challenge them? It's about understanding the historical context, the power dynamics, the social forces that are shaping our lives and our minds.
Okay, now in this final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the section of Jacoby's book that I think you found most fascinating. It's the part where he digs into what he calls the politics of subjectivity.
This is where I think Jacoby gets really insightful. He argues that in a society that's all about consumerism and individualism, even our very sense of self becomes political.
So he's saying that our feelings, our desires, even our anxieties, they're all being shaped by these larger forces, that we're not just individuals making choices in a vacuum.
Exactly. And it happens in ways that are often subtle and hard to notice. Think about all the advertising we see every day, telling us what to buy, how to look, what kind of person to be.
It's like they're creating needs that we didn't even know we had before.
Right. And those manufactured needs feed this cycle of consumerism, which is the lifeblood of capitalism. And here's the kicker. Jacoby thinks psychology is sometimes complicit in this whole process.
Hold on. How is psychology playing a role in shaping our subjectivity to fit the demands of the system?
By focusing so heavily on individual adaptation and self-improvement, psychology can sometimes distract us from those bigger social and political issues that are actually causing our distress. It's
Yeah.
almost like saying, here's how to be happy in a system that's designed to keep you unhappy.
That's a really thought-provoking way to put it. So it's not that individual therapy is inherently bad, it's just incomplete. Like you said before, it's treating the symptoms without addressing the root cause.
Exactly. And Jacoby argues that therapies that solely focus on individual change without considering the social context are ultimately going to be limited in their effectiveness.
So what's the alternative? If our very sense of self is being shaped by these powerful forces, what can we do? Does Jacoby have any answers for us?
That's the million-dollar question. And to be honest, Jacoby doesn't give us a clear-cut solution. He wasn't trying to write a utopia, and he wasn't promoting a specific political ideology, but he does offer some guidance, some places to start.
Like what? Give us some clues.
He emphasizes the importance of critical thinking and historical awareness. He wants us to understand how we got to this point, how our current social systems came to be, and how they could be different.
So it's about questioning assumptions, looking back to understand the present, and maybe even finding inspiration from the past, like those radical thinkers we've been discussing.
Yes, and it's also about collective action, working together to create change. He believed that real liberation can't just be an individual pursuit.
Because our personal struggles are often connected to these larger systemic issues, right? So it's not just about me and my problems, it's about us and our problems.
You got it. And Jacoby's point is that we need to recognize those connections. It's not either, it's both hand.
Okay, this is a lot to unpack, but I feel like we've only scratched the surface of Jacoby's ideas. What are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should be thinking about?
First, it's crucial to be aware of how our thinking, our beliefs, even our sense of self are shaped by the society we live in. We're not just these isolated individuals making choices in a vacuum. We're deeply embedded in a social and historical context.
We're products of our time and place, for sure.
Exactly. And that context includes systems of power and inequality, and they often thrive when we don't question the way things are, which is why Jacoby is so concerned about this idea of social amnesia.
So we need to be critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to psychology and self-help.
Yes. Ask yourself whose interests are being served by this theory. Does it challenge or reinforce existing power structures? Is it offering a real solution, or is it just a Band-Aid?
And finally, we need to think about those limitations of purely individual solutions to problems that are deeply rooted in society.
Personal growth and healing are important, but they can't be separated from the fight for social justice. It's not either, it's both hand.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. We'll be right back after a short break to wrap up our deep dive into Russell Jacoby's Social Amnesia. Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, as we've been talking about Russell Jacoby's Social Amnesia, I've been thinking about how relevant his ideas still feel today. We're bombarded with messages telling us what to buy, how to look, even how to feel.
It's like we're swimming in a sea of influence,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes it's hard to even tell where the water ends and we begin. Jacoby calls this the politics of subjectivity, and it's a powerful concept.
Yeah, it really struck a chord with me, too. It's this idea that in a society obsessed with consumerism and individualism, our sense of self, our desires, anxieties, even our deepest insecurities become deeply intertwined with the demands of the system.
Exactly. Think about it. Under capitalism, a successful individual is often defined by what they own, what they achieve, how they measure up against others. So it's no surprise that feelings of inadequacy and anxiety run rampant.
It's almost like we're set up to feel incomplete, like we're always striving for something just out of reach, and then we're offered all these products and therapies that promise to fix us, to make us whole again.
Right, and that's where Jacoby sees a real danger. By focusing solely on individual solutions to what are often societal problems, we risk reinforcing the very system that's creating those problems in the first place.
We're back to that Band-Aid analogy, aren't we? Trying to fix the symptoms without addressing the underlying cause.
Exactly. And this is where psychology can play a tricky role. On the one hand, it can help us understand ourselves better, cope with difficult emotions, and heal from past traumas. But on the other hand, as Jacoby points out, it can also become a tool for adapting to a system that's inherently unjust.
So it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater, it's about being more aware of those potential pitfalls, right? About asking ourselves those tough questions. Whose interests are being served by this theory? Is it promoting genuine well-being? Or is it just helping me fit into a system that doesn't actually serve my best interest?
That's the key takeaway. Jacoby doesn't want us to abandon psychology or therapy altogether. He wants us to be more critical, more aware, of the larger context in which these things operate. To remember that individual healing and social change are intertwined, not mutually exclusive.
Okay, so what do we do with all this? If we're all swimming in the sea of influence, how do we even begin to navigate it? Does Jacoby offer a way forward?
He doesn't provide a step-by-step guide, but he does offer some crucial starting points. First and foremost, he emphasizes the importance of historical awareness. Understanding how we got to this point, how these systems of power came to be, is crucial for being able to imagine something different.
It's like you can't dismantle a machine if you don't understand how it works.
Exactly. And that historical awareness can also help us reclaim those lost memories, those radical ideas that challenge the status quo, those movements for social justice that pave the way for progress.
That makes me think about how we were talking about those neo-Freudians earlier. They were, in a way, trying to adapt Freud's ideas to the prevailing norms of their time. But maybe what we need now is to go back to those original critiques, to those radical roots, and see what they can teach us about the present.
I think that's a brilliant insight. Jacoby would absolutely agree with that. He also emphasizes the importance of critical thinking. Don't just accept things at face value. Question everything. Challenge assumptions, especially when it comes to those messages that tell you who you should be and what you should want.
So it's about becoming more aware of our own internal narratives, questioning where those beliefs come from and how they might be serving the system instead of serving us. And it's about understanding that our personal struggles are often connected to these larger societal issues. It's not just about me and my problems, it's about us and our problems.
Yes, exactly. And that realization can be both empowering and motivating. It reminds us that we're not alone in our struggles and that collective action is possible. Change happens when people come together to challenge those systems of power that perpetuate inequality and injustice.
Wow, this has been such a thought-provoking deep dive, and it's given me so much to think about. It's like you were saying before, there's a sense of urgency and possibility in Jacoby's work. The urgency comes from recognizing how powerful those forces of social amnesia are, and the possibility comes from knowing that we have the power to resist them.
Yes. And that power comes from knowledge, from awareness, from understanding how our minds and our society are intertwined.
It's about remembering our history,
Yeah.
reclaiming those lost voices, and questioning everything.
Exactly. It's about waking up to the ways in which our subjectivity is being shaped and then choosing to shape it ourselves.
And that, my friends, is what this deep dive is all about. We hope you've enjoyed exploring these ideas with us. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.